Transformation of East Pakistan into Bangladesh is one of great contemporary relevance. It is a story of not only the importance of the politics of human rights, but also of how India shook off the two shibboleths of non-violence and non-alignment that had enslaved her since independence and replaced them with military power and what I call convenient alignment in inverted commas to further her political and moral position on the world stage. Showing great compassion and a decisive application of realpolitik, the Prime Minister of the day, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, not only opened India's arms to a staggering 10 million refugees from East Pakistan, but also created the basis of sending them home to a different future from their immediate horrifying past. Was this the only compulsion behind India's decision to militarily attack and effect the sequestration of East Pakistan from West Pakistan? Or was there perhaps more to it? Was there fear that Pakistan would take advantage of the intense street fighting in Calcutta and many parts of West Bengal between Naxalites and the security forces, which was at its peak in 1971, by providing cross-border sanctuary to the militant cadre Marxist-Leninist? The CPI-ML, which had been formed in 1967 informally, and 69 it had broken away from the CPM, was Operation Steeplechase against the Naxalites, which was a combined army-cum-police operation led by General Jacob, our famous General Jacob, who negotiated with General Niazi and effected the surrender. And General Jacob led Operation Steeplechase between July and August 1971. And was this Operation Steeplechase really the first part of a two-part strategy to bringing about regime change in Dhaka and permanently deny Pakistan this card on our eastern borders? So with one fell swoop of realpolitik, Mrs. Gandhi was trying to probably ensure that Pakistan no longer had access to trouble India on her eastern borders. And at the same time, she was also trying to neutralize the Naxalite threat, which had overwhelmed her government at that point of time. Within this backdrop, there was an international issue as well, and that was that in 1969, the Soviets had penetrated deep into Xinjiang and given the Chinese a bloody nose. And the Chinese were actually quaking with fear with respect to the Soviets. And the Soviets had ensured that the Chinese would not intervene in as much as India's military action took place and was confined to East Pakistan. Now, this is obviously a great epic. And to discuss this great but presently underrated epic, I have with me two very eminent warriors who played their own brave and significant roles in this epic. Major General Cardozo, Ian Cardozo, whom so much has been said about, needs no further introduction, and Lieutenant General Nirbhay Sharma. So I'll start with General Cardozo. General Cardozo, why did India intervene militarily in East Pakistan in the way that we went about it? More specifically, what were the compulsions in your view that necessitated militarily entering East Pakistan?
Today, can you hear me? Today we've had a lot of discussions and questions and answers about the diplomatic, the political, and the social aspects of this war. But the answer to the compulsions as to why the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi decided to intervene militarily in East Pakistan, I would like to give a very simplistic answer. And that is, if some hoodlums had come to your house and forced 20 people to stay with you for time immemorial, and you have to feed them and clothe them and attend to all their needs for keeps, what would you do? you'd probably go to the police. If you didn't find an answer, you'd probably go to the government. And if you didn't get an answer, what would you do? That's exactly what happened to India and the Prime Minister. When Pakistan instituted genocide, of which you've heard about all this morning, so I don't have to go into more details. When 1 million people were killed and thousands or lakhs of women were raped, girls raped, and 10 million refugees came into India, into the states of West Bengal, Tripura and Orissa. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi visited these camps and she heard the horror stories. And she decided that, and they all wanted to go back. And therefore now if you look at every country ought to have a vision. I don't know whether India has one. China has one, certainly. But the vision at that time was short. It was for a short period. And after listening to these refugees and looking at the situation for her own country, the Prime Minister decided on military intervention as the only route out. But she was concerned about world opinion. She approached the UN, which was a toothless image of rectitude, led by the Americans. She went to the Americans, she went to the British, she spoke in Paris in French, but the Western nations and the UN were blind and deaf to the problems that were created both in East Pakistan by the genocide and the refugees in India. And the UN stated categorically, backed by, of course, by the Americans, that the genocide in East Pakistan is an internal matter of Pakistan, and therefore we need not intervene. And as far as the refugee problem is concerned, it is a bilateral problem between India and Pakistan. So, what could Indira Gandhi do? So she called Sam, the army chief, and said, I think we've lost all the options, now we need to go militarily. But the army chief said, I'm sorry, we are not ready for a military intervention. I've got a whole list of requests, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Defense, which have not been looked at. We are not ready to go to war. Then the Prime Minister very astutely, firstly, we need to understand and appreciate the fact that there was total convergence and cooperation between the three armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and total synergy between the armed forces, the politician and the bureaucrat. Due to the Prime Minister, he told the ministries of defense and finance to do what the chief wanted, but the chief also wanted time. There are many factors which cannot be discussed now, but she listened to what the chief had to say, and she decided that she would use this time usefully by visiting London, Paris, and USA, New York, as well as the UN. But she talked to Richard Nixon and Kissinger, but they all turned a deaf ear to her. So she, as far as the world is concerned, she took every step possible to prevent war. And when that was not heeded to, it was inevitable that military action was the only answer. So that was the compulsion which necessitated military intervention in East Pakistan by India. Now, you would, I'm sure, know that the Western nations, particularly America, has intervened in any number of countries across the world, and no questions asked. But when India had to legitimately take military intervention into East Pakistan, there were many questions being asked. What were your compulsions? Why should you go into? So I think this is ridiculous. Therefore, as far as the Naxalite movement is concerned, Mr. Iqbal Malhotra is very correct in saying that nothing much has been spoken about this. Nothing much has been written about it, except Jacob has made a couple of a small paragraph in his book to say that there was a Naxalite movement before the war which was contained. How it was contained, what happened, I'm sorry, I don't know.
So basically what you're saying is that there were three reasons. The first was economic, because there were all these refugees who were in India and they had to be fed and clothed and they wanted to go back. The second was moral and ethical, that there was genocide and rape and murder and mayhem going on in East Pakistan, and that had to, a stop had to be put to it, and the Western nations were ignoring us. And the third factor was this, that Mrs. Gandhi gave them a long rope and tried to see if the world would intercede and step in. And when the world didn't intercede and step in, then she decided to do that. And in doing so, she abandoned the traditional pillars of non-alignment and non-violence that had governed our philosophy for 25 years. So there were three reasons, basically.
Absolutely.
I will now turn to General Sharma.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Another thing we need to understand is that, as was spoken this morning, Pakistan had allied itself with America and China, and this was done by Yahya Khan brokering a meeting between Nixon and Mao Zedong, and after that Pakistan could do no wrong, and therefore America backed Pakistan wholeheartedly.
Okay.
And also that because of that, the master stroke of Indira Gandhi was to have a friendship arrangement with Russia, Soviet Russia, and Russia, we need to remember that Russia helped us no end, both in the Bay of Bengal as well as in the UN, which we seem to have forgotten very conveniently.
Okay, General Sharma, what were the contours of the actual plan to invade East Pakistan? And how did the Indian Army operationally execute it? Did the plan work as expected, or were there any glitches?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I would not repeat what has already been said. Basically, I'll take on to respond to your question from the time that the war clouds had started building. Now, this period from March to early December, as far as the military was concerned, we indulged in preparing ourselves in terms of re-equipping some of its formations. We also had to take a very calculated risk and make an assessment to move out some of the formations and troops which were guarding our northern border. Because all along our entire defensive posture was poised towards either north or west. Now, this itself took quite some time, and while all happening, as brought out Arduino, our political leadership went around trying to build a public opinion, and also while we found hostility and certain amount of resentment on the part of America, we also signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. If you recall, at that time, the Cold War was at its peak, and the two opposing powers definitely were confronting each other. We did that. As far as in 62, of course, and even 65, they were quite hostile to us. It was a very assessment made. We are not going to interfere this time because they were tied to the Soviet Union. It was confronting them over UCD River, and there was some movement of troops in Manchuria. Therefore, three things happened. We prepared ourselves. We found that the world opinion may be gradually coming around, but there was a counter we had in terms of Soviet treaty. And of course, we knew and we realized that it was a chance we took, and I think it worked very well, that Chinese are not going to do that. Now, having said that, let me get to the actual plans. And you very rightly asked whether plans materialize the way. So no plan ever works the plan. When the first shot is fired, that plan goes for a six. Basically, the issues with us were, oh, what should be our terminal objective? There will not debate many times whether Dhaka was our objective. I think in this situation, a mobile pair of shots, and you cannot decide on the terminal objective right from the beginning because it's not a set piece orchestrated conventional battle that we are fighting. But ultimately, it was very clear that your terminal objective had to be Dhaka because Dhaka was the center of gravity, right? That was one. As far as forces are concerned, we were able to muster, I think, around 7 to 8 division worth of troops. We had 33 corps in the north, we had 2 corps in the west, and we had 4 corps in the east. Together, I'm not going into the nuts and bolts, otherwise it takes a lot of time. On the other hand, Pakistanis, initially they had a division plus, but they had built it up to about 4 divisions. Plus they had Razakars, and Razakars of 2 varieties were the Mujahids, and the other were the Ansaris. So all told, the force levels were quite comparable. What tilted in our favor in terms of force level was the element of Mukti Bahini and the local support that we had. There are views on it as to how relevant they were, but I think overall it was a big factor in our and a resource which we had. Now, having talked about the objective, having talked about the forces, I forgot about the Air Force. Pakistan had one squadron in East Pakistan of sabers, and that's about all. We had a fairly good air advantage over there. Now, what were our plans? You know, the terrain in East Pakistan is nice, we have water. But in any case, we had decided to go after it. But at the same time, the choice was whether to attack the fortified positions which Pakistanis had occupied or to bypass. Pakistanis miscalculated our objectives, and they thought that if they were to hold on to strong points in certain communication centers, they will reduce our ingress up to a certain point. And I expected the UN and the others to come in. What they had not bargained for, and what we did was that we invariably bypassed these strong points. And wherever we did not, the operations were delayed, and we paid a price for it, whether it is Delhi, whether it is Delhi, or many, or in Bogra for that matter. But that much said that we decided to bypass them. Now, with this, there were 3 very clearly discernible thrust lines of 33 corps, 2 corps, and 4 corps. Now, in terms of terrain, there is this area between Jamna and Meghna River, which actually culminates almost short of Dhaka. That area has least amount of river obstacles. And if an ingress is made through that, it can definitely succeed. Pakistanis, in their scheme of things, to what I just said. Now, what happened? The battle joined. We know how it. Pakistanis attacked our airfields. We had to maintain a very balanced posture on the other, because so therefore we did that, and I think their initial thing did not succeed at all. But what happened on the eastern side? We launched the attack, and progress was slow. By about 10th of December, there was some kind of a, I won't say stalemate, but we had slowed down. 4 corps crossed Meghna that day with helicopters. I'll talk about that later at time permitting. But that is all. It is at this time that the Indian Army decided to use the airborne troops. Now, airborne troops are used to speed up or to bottle up the enemy, get behind it. In this case, what we had done, and we had thought of it well in advance, because one officer from our setup had moved in sometime middle of November. He was infiltrated inside, and he was interacting with the an element Bahini, and he had given us a fairly good idea. And our assessment was that Tangail is a good objective where Bahini has certain gold, and if we were to capture that, we'll do two things. One, we'll bottle up the forces, Pakistani forces which were at Jamalpur on the Jamna, and speed up our operations. And this was one axis which was not well guarded by Pakistan. Right. Now, thereafter, how the airborne operations went, I won't talk about it now, maybe later when you ask me. But what I would like to bring out here is that in our entire operations, three things were very clear. I found many times in you, Pakistani companies and battalions fought well in many cases. But the higher leadership was totally demoralized. I'll give you an example. From Jamalpur, when I think the 93 Brigade, when it was deploying, one of their battalion commanders refused to surrender. And he said, look, soldiers don't surrender, they fight with a gun. A couple later, of course, he was trapped and taken in. A couple of hours later, I saw their brigade commander at Tangail, highly demoralized. Likewise, you found that in Pakistan's case, the higher leadership which failed miserably, and it is lack of support he did damage. The leader that you feel for more. Maybe when I talk about the airborne operation, is that okay?
General Sharma, thank you. I'll just turn to General Cardozo now. General Cardozo, much has been said about the abandonment of traditional British tactics in the invasion of East Pakistan and the use of heliborne troops by India. In fact, General Sharma has also just referred to that. Since you were a part of that heliborne force, can you shed some light on how it rolled out, and was this leaf taken out of Operation Musketeer during the Suez War of 1956 by the Royal Marines, or was it based on the Battle of La Drang Valley in Vietnam in November 1965?
I think it has also been commented earlier in the day that the British Indian Army before independence was trained by Britain both in World War I and World War II to attack the enemy where it is strongest and to move forward only after the objective has been captured. Now, the strategy of General Niazi was GOC&C of all forces in East Pakistan had decided to defend East Pakistan by a string of fortresses, which he called the fortress concept. These fortresses were based on communication centers and built across river obstacles and deep minefields, and fell within the defended areas of the brigades and the divisions. He hoped that the Indian Army would attack these fortresses and get stuck. In the meantime, he hoped that the Americans and the Chinese would intervene. But the Indian generals saw through his plan and decided that this would not happen, and they assaulted the defenses in the gaps between these fortresses and headed for the objectives in depth. Now, whereas Niazi's concept of defensive strategy had a strong outer crust, he had no depth and he had no reserves. So the operations moved much faster than we anticipated. So that in brief is how we secured our objectives so fast. However, I think we need to understand also that there was a difference of opinion in the strategy as evolved by General Jacob in Calcutta, Eastern Command, and by the Indian Army in Delhi. The Indian Army in Delhi strategy was based on the Prime Minister's vision that we need to capture enough territory in East Pakistan for the refugees to go back. And therefore, as was mentioned earlier also, Sam Manekshaw felt we'd go to the river line, the 4 offensive formations, surround Dhaka, and Dhaka would fall automatically. But Jacob felt that Dhaka was the nerve center of East Pakistan and it needed to be captured. Ultimately, it panned out that I'd also like to compare the race for Dhaka with the race for Berlin. Whereas the race for Dhaka, India had no aim to capture territory, whereas in the race for Berlin, the Allies, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Russians were all rushing towards Berlin to capture territory. Secondly, there was a lot of street fighting on the streets of Berlin and a lot of bloodshed amongst the civil population, which the Indian government did not want to happen. So, when on the 14th of December evening, when the 4 attacking formations surrounded Dhaka, the government of India sent word that you will not fight on the streets of Dhaka. We will make the political and the military government capitulate and surrender by other means. So that is what actually happened. And I don't know whether I've answered your question.
So can I ask you an allied question that how many helicopters were actually involved in this, and did they bring in land waves after waves of troops? How was this operation actually conceived and coordinated?
Yeah, so this also relates now to Operation Musketeer and what happened in Vietnam, in Da Nang. Operation Musketeer by the Royal Marines was supported by many forces. The Para Brigade, the British Infantry Division, the French, the Israelis, and they had much time to train for this operation. It's, I think, not known to all of you, but the heliborne operation for the capture of Sylhet, of which I was part of, it was the quickest heliborne operation in world military history. On the 7th of December at 7 a.m., the CO, a very brave and courageous officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arun Harolekar, received orders, you will go in for the capture of Sylhet. The enemy, the 202 Infantry Pakistan Brigade, has moved out for the defense of Dhaka. You don't have a problem. There are only 200 Razakars defending Dhaka. Number 2, at 9:30, an Alouette helicopter came to take Colonel Harolekar to recce a site from the air where our troops would land. At 2:30, the same day, we were flown into Sylhet. Now, when I was in Staff College, we were told that the Army and the Air Force have got to cooperate and coordinate, and it takes at least a week of planning a heliborne operation. That didn't happen. Within 6 hours, we got the orders and we were inside Sylhet. So there's a great difference between also the helicopters, to answer your question. There were only 10 helicopters, and they were B-4 helicopters. The B-4 can take only a section of fully armed troops. And out of those, for our operation, 2 were unfit. So 8 helicopters in 2 waves, because you can't have 8 helicopters milling around a small area of the battleground. And so there were 4, and they came back, and the next 4 went in waves. So,
did you receive any ground fire when you were landing?
Plenty of ground fire because Sagat made a mistake. He received wrong information that 202 Pakistan Infantry Brigade has moved for the defense of Dhaka. It was still there. And when the first wave of 4-5 GR landed the Charlie Company in the battalion headquarters at about 3:30 on the 7th of December, there was 202 Brigade and 313 Brigade, which actually was supposed to move to Dhaka, reinforced Sylhet. So we had 2 infantry brigades and the Sylhet garrison. Now, for those of you who do not know, I think everybody knows that a brigade consists of 3 battalions. A battalion consists of 1,000 men. So a brigade consists of 3,000 men. 2 brigades mean 6,000 people. And the Sylhet garrison, they were ultimately, when they surrendered, 3 brigadiers, 2 full colonels, 173 officers, 290 JCOs, and 8,000 troops surrendered to 45 GR, which was half a battalion. By that time, we were only 352.
But then these the Pakistanis didn't fight at all.
The Pakistanis, I think, what helped us was the BBC.
I see.
The Indian government had allowed foreign correspondents to accompany our troops. They ate with them, they marched with them, they slept alongside.
So they were embedded with you.
They were embedded with us and they were giving, whereas the Pakistan radio nobody believed, including the Pakistanis. All India radio was giving information 24 hours later because they had to get clearance from army headquarters. The BBC and other foreign correspondents were reporting activities as they happened on the ground, which was great because the world was accepting information from neutral organizations. And 2 things happened. BBC announced on the 9th of December, a brigade of Gurkhas has landed at Sylhet. So the CEO and I were listening, and we knew the Pakistanis were listening. So we said, let's pretend to be a brigade. So we moved Charlie Company and Delta Company and Alpha Company forward to simulate a brigade. But there was a big risk there because the inter-operational distance between the companies and interlocking of MMGs could not take place. But we took that risk. It was only later on when a Pakistani patrol went through one of the gaps and we had to fight and chase them out. Then the CEO and I said, what would we do if we were in Pakistan's place? And the answer we arrived at, we would attack. So we said, let's get the companies back, because if we have to die, we should die after giving them a bloody nose, and we should be together, because we were short of ammunition. When the CEO and I were going around the troops, they were sharpening their kukri. So we said, in Nepali, what are you doing? He said, Saab, don't worry, if we don't have ammunition, our trusted weapon is here, we'll use the kukri. Now I'd like to tell you, answer your question. Why did Pakistan, when they had such a lot of force, not really attack us with full vigor and energy? Because we had fought 2 battles earlier at places called Atgram and Ghazipur. At Atgram, 45 GR launched the last kukri attack in modern military history. We had no artillery to support us because 8 Div did not have artillery. So the CEO said, we'll attack by night, we'll do a surprise attack, and we will use our kukris. That night, moonlight night, the moonlight reflected the blades of the kukris. We severed 32 heads and disembodied, annihilated Charlie Company of 31st Punjab. And those who survived ran back and told their people, don't mess with the Gurkhas, you'll lose your head.
Wow.
Then was the Battle of Ghazipur, where another infantry battalion of ours failed to capture Ghazipur, and Sagat Singh said, send the Gurkhas. So we went to Ghazipur. By this time, we had lost 2 officers in Atgram and a JCO. In the Battle of Ghazipur, we lost second in command, and 4 officers got wounded. So whereas we started the war with 18 officers, by the time we got orders to capture Sylhet, we were reduced to 11. And the CEO asked for time. Can I reorganize my companies to put the company commanders in place? Sagat Singh said, no. Tell the Gurkhas to move immediately. I know them, they're the best suited for this job. And so we went in again. And now, to answer your question, why did Pakistan not attack us when they were in such an overwhelming strength? Of course, they did attack us a number of times. We were lucky. Full tribute and respect and praise for the Air Force. When there were large groups of Pakistanis that wanted to attack us, we had an ACT with us, an air control team, and they got whistled up the fighters from Kumbigram and from Guwahati, and they broke up these attacks. But at night we were alone. So it was a combination of all these facts, and BBC helped. And I think
So you used psychology and terror to
Yes.
actually overawe the enemy.
yes, this was not only we didn't realize it at that time, but it was the psychology of the use of the kukri that disempowered the Pakistani and lost their will to fight. And they couldn't believe when when the surrender was about to take place. Two captains with white flags and 1,000 troops came to surrender to us. The CO said, fire an MMG burst close to them. Tell them not to come forward. Why? Because he was worried that if they came to understand that we were less than half a battalion, they might change their mind. He said, tell them to go back. Then they said, we said this is the order of the CO. Then they said, can we talk to the brigade commander? Then we realized that we had bluffed them. And then we got to the brigade commander, please come and take the surrender. So when the brigade commander came, he was escorted by the Johnnies with their kukris. And they said, Salam alaikum. And he said, Walaikum salam. Who has come in this chopper? So Brigadier Bunty Quinn said, I have. Why do you ask? So they said, but are you not here? He said, no, I'm 100 kilometers away. Then they said, what is here? And he said, only a battalion, and that too, half a battalion. They couldn't believe their ears. There was much murmuring amongst them. So they got the shock of their life that we were only half a battalion. We got the shock of our lives when 3 brigadiers, so many officers, so many JSOs, 8,000 troops surrendered to us.
That goes down in history as the night of the long knives.
Yes.
Okay.
The curved knife. So, please, yeah, please.
He was the brigade commander in
Yeah.
What happened actually, another brigade was, this was in
313.
Moloi Bazar.
Yeah, Babli Bazaar. Yeah.
They were ordered by Niazi to move to Akhauda.
Okay.
The commander chickened out.
Yeah.
He went to Sylhet because he thought the hilly area he'll be safe there. He didn't want to go and take the firing in. That's the reason the 2 brigades were there. One brigade was actually, they violated the rules and hiding over there. One thing, sir, you forgot to tell. Sorry, sir. 2.5 days you had no ration.
No, 9 days.
No, 2.5 days you had no food to eat.
No. You see what I'll explain. When we were ordered to go around, the teaching in all schools of instruction is that when a paradrop operation takes place or a heliborne operation takes place, you got to link up within 48 hours. If that does not happen, the force which has been paradropped or heliborne landed, they will disintegrate due to casualties, lack of ammunition, lack of supplies, and the defending force will be reinforced. So it is essential that the heliborne force, our battalion, had to be reinforced within 48 hours. We were not, the div commander committed himself and said, we will reinforce you within 48 hours. We were not reinforced for 9 days and 9 nights.
So what did you eat?
Firstly, water. There was no water. There were these muddy ponds full of muck. We had nothing to do. We were just straining it through our handkerchiefs, and my stomach has gone for a 6 since then. We had to scrabble for grain left on the floors of the huts which were within the defended area and cook something out of that. We could not cook much, but I don't know how we survived on basic rice, the raw rice hardly cooked, and dirty water. But if, I think we'll come to that later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sir, I have a serious Indians didn't attack 1971 young generation will take it wrong. On 2nd of December, Yahya Khan went to Peshawar. Suddenly, he was in the VIP room. There was an understanding and the air chief went with him. On the second night, 60 aircrafts took off from Peshawar Air Base, bombed 10 air bases in India. I have the entire name with me. Why? The Operation 67 Operation Arab-Israeli War. On the first night, they destroyed all the Arab countries' aircraft. They thought in 10 air bases, all the Indian aircrafts are there. But some way, Indians knew about it. Only 2 aircrafts are partially damaged. All the aircrafts are moved out. And that Indira Gandhi was on that day in Kolkata. She rushed back and declared the war. So it was Pakistanis who were the aggressors. I have records to prove that, sir. Yeah. Indians never were the aggressors in that war. And whatever we are discussing, sir, our new generation will take it wrong. They did the aggression. They attacked every border village. I told you, sir, 674 Indian villagers were killed in total in Agartala border, which is adjacent to the border actually. So they were the aggressors and they should be held accountable in the pages of history for attacking first. India was never the aggressors. And after that, she had to formally declare going to the parliament.
Thank you, Colonel.
Can I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Sajad. What actually happened is that Pakistan did attack all these airfields, and when Indira Gandhi, as Sajad was saying, was returning from Calcutta, she was coming to Delhi. The aircraft was diverted to Lucknow, and the pilot sent for, I think, D.P. Dar, who was on the plane, and spoke to him. And he came back and told Dixit and Peter Senai, who were the diplomats traveling on that plane, he said, that idiot has done exactly what we wanted by attacking first. So it gave India a clean chit. Not that we were not prepared to attack. We had prepared our plans to attack. But fortunately for us, Pakistan attacked first. And as far as the world is concerned, they attacked India first.
Okay, I think I'll turn to General Sharma now to get a perspective on the paradrops. General Sharma, you were paradropped into Dhaka and were a part of the first Indian Army unit to enter that city. How did that operation go? And did this first time use of paratroopers along with heliborne troops in the subcontinental theatre psychologically unnerve General Niazi?
Well, I think we've talked at length about the heliborne operations, which was a very tremendous activity. I'll just give you a very brief rundown of the airborne operation, because we've been well read and there is a lot which has been said on that. And then maybe, if you permit, I'll just give you some takeaways of this entire operation, because we are now looking at a victory which came our way, a hard-fought victory. But also this glory has its own price. And I would start by talking about the airborne operation first before I talk about the takeaways. On 11th December, we were paradropped at a place near Tangai, which is about 60 odd miles northwest of Dhaka. Well, initially there was a tremendous amount of discussion whether we should be dropped directly at Kumritola, which is the airport of Dhaka, or it should be Tangai. I think ultimately it was decided that if we were to assault Kumritola, it may be stretching ourselves a little too far. Right? Tangai was chosen, and like I mentioned, we had a fairly good groundwork done. Now, airborne operation is inherent for its complexities. There is, and for this operation, we had to use the entire transport fleet of the Indian Air Force, 50 aircraft in all. We used 2 mounting airfields, Raikunda and then Dum-Dum. We use all sorts of aircraft. We use Packets, we use AN-12, we use Dakotas, we use Caribou, whatever we have. I will not go into the details of the flight and how the drop took place. Suffice it to say that soon after we were dropped, we advanced and captured our initial objective, which was the bridge at Pungli on River Lohajang, which is on the outskirts of Tangai. Enemy was still on the other side, 93 Brigade, they were way behind. They did not expect this drop to take place. And the drop timings had been advanced by about 2 hours. We were to be dropped at about 7:30, but we were dropped 2 hours in advance so that we could. Now that worked to our advantage because much later on 16th, when I met the garrison commander at Mirpur, he said, "हाँ हमें पता था पूरी para brigade drop हुई है." Exactly the way Cardozo is talking about. So we were able to consolidate before the first column of 93 Brigade came in. They were taken totally by surprise. Our capture of the bridge was relatively easier, except that what pained us the most was that some of these fellows, before they were taken in, we found some women who had just been killed there in the conflict. One of the reasons why they lost the war. Anyway, after that, we found that the Jamalpur resistance had broken because they were under the impression the whole brigade was behind, and they started. In that, we inflicted heavy casualties, and thereafter, next day, a link-up took place. A link-up took place with 1st Maratha. We had 2 para, which is old 3rd Maratha. And my CEO, late Purvan Pannu, had told CEO, 1st Maratha, that when he links up with us, we'll welcome him with a tot of ram. And I remember when that drop took place and we were collecting ammunition, our guns were being dropped, everything. The Subedar Major Bahadur Sahab was more worried about the jerry cans which had been dropped because they had to keep the promise. But that is the kind of a thing which Army has, and we were able to link up and then consolidate. Having done that, we found that the advance towards Dhaka was slowing down.
General Sharma, I want to interrupt. I think we've overstepped our time, and they want to bring in the next session. So I'm sorry to have to interrupt you at this point. And thank you, gentlemen, for a great conversation. And thank you very much.
Can I make a brief comment about General Sagat? General Sagat Singh is the finest field commander this country has ever produced. During the battle, during the war, he was all the time in his helicopter, monitoring what is happening on the ground, using flexibility, changing plans, and he was quite clear he wanted to be the first in Dhaka. He was lucky to have Group Captain Chandan Singh, who was equally energetic, equally brave, and they both understood that risk-taking is part of defense decisions taken by the army in war. And they had a person like Harolekar who delivered goods irrespective of the problem that he faced. So Sagat, finest field commander, lucky to have people under him who are equally brave, equally courageous, equally decisive. But in my book on the 1971 war, I mentioned that Sagat Singh was also ruthless. And the editor said, please don't use that word. But you know, we have something, when we are taught in the IMA, bedar, without fear, without pity, without remorse. And that is part of being ruthless. And I think when you're dealing with China and Pakistan, you need to be ruthless.
Thank you, General. Thank you.